Certain phrases from avoidant partners serve as definitive red flags that signal not just temporary emotional unavailability, but fundamental incompatibility with healthy relationship dynamics. These statements reveal their core beliefs about intimacy, commitment, and emotional responsibility that predict years of frustration, emotional starvation, and psychological damage if you continue the relationship. Recognizing these phrases as relationship death sentences, rather than problems to solve, can save you from investing precious time and emotional energy in someone who has explicitly told you they cannot meet your basic relationship needs. Phrase 1. I don't do emotions, or I'm just not an emotional person. When an avoidant partner declares that they don't do emotions or aren't an emotional person, they're providing you with crucial information about their capacity for intimate partnership that you must take at face value. This isn't a cute quirk or temporary limitation. It's a fundamental statement about their relationship with emotional expression, vulnerability, and connection that predicts profound incompatibility with anyone seeking genuine partnership. This phrase reveals their core belief that emotions are optional aspects of human experience rather than essential components of intimate relationships. They're not saying they struggle with emotions or need help developing emotional skills. They're declaring that emotional engagement is simply not part of their identity or relationship repertoire. This represents a fundamental philosophical incompatibility with healthy partnership that cannot be overcome through patience, understanding, or love. The psychology behind this statement involves their deep-seated belief that emotional expression represents weakness, chaos, or loss of control that threatens their carefully constructed identity. They've organized their entire personality around emotional suppression and view their emotional detachment as a strength rather than a limitation. This mindset makes them fundamentally resistant to the vulnerability and emotional reciprocity that intimate relationships require. When someone tells you they don't do emotions, they're essentially saying they cannot and will not participate in the emotional labor that relationships require. They won't comfort you during difficult times, won't share their own struggles and fears, won't engage in emotional problem solving, and won't provide the emotional presence and availability that partnership demands. They're describing an emotional desert where your relationship will slowly die from lack of nourishment. This declaration also serves as preemptive justification for their future emotional unavailability. When you need emotional support and they provide none, when you express feelings and they respond with indifference, when you seek emotional intimacy and they withdraw, they'll reference this early statement as evidence that you were warned about their limitations. They've inoculated themselves against responsibility for your emotional needs by declaring them outside their purview. The phrase represents their attempt to shift responsibility for relationship, emotional health, entirely onto your shoulders. Since they don't do emotions, you'll be expected to provide all emotional labor, processing, and regulation for both of you while receiving no reciprocal support. This creates a fundamentally exploitative dynamic where you become their emotional caretaker while they remain emotionally parasitic. People who genuinely struggle with emotional expression typically acknowledge this as a limitation they want to work on, not a fixed aspect of their identity they're proud of. They might say, I have trouble expressing emotions, but I want to get better at it, rather than declaring emotional engagement fundamentally incompatible with who they are. The distinction between recognizing emotional challenges and rejecting emotional responsibility entirely is crucial for predicting relationship potential. This phrase also reveals their fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology and relationship dynamics. All humans are emotional beings, and claiming otherwise represents either profound self-deception or manipulative impression management designed to avoid relationship responsibilities. Healthy adults understand that emotional connection is the foundation of intimate partnership, not an optional extra for people who happen to be emotional types. Phrase 2. I don't believe in labels, or I don't like to define things. When avoidant partners resist relationship definitions by claiming they don't believe in labels or don't like to define things, they're revealing their fundamental unwillingness to commit to the accountability and mutual responsibility that defined relationships require. This isn't about preferring organic relationship development. It's about maintaining the freedom to withdraw, pursue other options, or minimize their obligations without technically violating relationship agreements. This phrase serves as sophisticated emotional manipulation designed to keep you invested in a relationship while preventing you from establishing the security and clarity that healthy partnerships provide. By refusing to define your connection, they maintain maximum flexibility for their own behavior while keeping you in a constant state of uncertainty about where you stand and what you can expect from them. The psychology behind label resistance involves their deep fear of accountability and commitment that comes with clearly defined relationship roles. When relationships remain undefined, they can withdraw emotionally or physically without technically betraying established agreements. They can pursue other romantic interests without technically cheating, prioritize other people and activities without technically neglecting you, and generally behave as single people while still accessing the benefits of your emotional investment. This statement also reveals their belief that relationship commitment represents a trap or limitation, rather than a foundation for deeper intimacy and security. They view relationship definitions as restrictions on their freedom, rather than structures that create safety for vulnerability and emotional investment. This fundamental misunderstanding of how healthy relationships work predicts endless conflict about commitment, reliability, and mutual responsibility. Label resistance typically coincides with their unwillingness to introduce you to important people in their life, make future plans together, or integrate you into their world in meaningful ways. If your relationship can't be defined, it also can't be acknowledged, celebrated, or built upon. You remain perpetually peripheral to their life, while they enjoy central access to yours. The refusal to define relationships also prevents you from establishing appropriate boundaries and expectations. When you don't know what you are to each other, you can't determine what behavior is acceptable or unacceptable. This ambiguity serves their need to avoid accountability while leaving you constantly guessing about your role and their level of commitment. This phrase often emerges when you begin asking for greater commitment, exclusivity, or future planning. Instead of honestly discussing their capacity for these things, they deflect by suggesting that labels are unnecessary or limiting. This deflection prevents serious conversations about relationship progression while maintaining the status quo that serves their needs. The timing of label resistance is also revealing. Partners who are genuinely committed and emotionally available naturally want to define and celebrate their relationships. They're proud to claim you and excited to establish the mutual commitment that allows relationships to deepen. Resistance to definition typically indicates ambivalence about your worth or their desire for ongoing connection. People who genuinely prefer organic relationship development still acknowledge mutual commitment and responsibility, even without formal labels. They might say, I don't need titles, but I'm committed to building something meaningful with you, rather than using label resistance to avoid all relationship accountability and definition. Phrase 3. You're too needy or you're too emotional. When avoidant partners label your normal relationship needs as excessive by calling you too needy, too emotional, or too intense, they're engaging in gaslighting designed to make you question your own perceptions and minimize your legitimate relationship requirements. This phrase represents their attempt to pathologize your healthy, human needs for connection, emotional reciprocity, and partnership, rather than acknowledge their own inability to meet basic relationship standards. This statement reveals their fundamental belief that emotional needs are character flaws rather than normal human requirements for intimate partnership. By labeling your needs as excessive, they position themselves as reasonable and you as demanding, shifting focus from their emotional limitations to your supposed emotional dysfunction. This reversal prevents honest examination of their capacity for partnership while making you responsible for accommodating their emotional deficits. The psychology behind this labeling involves their deep discomfort with emotional vulnerability and interdependence that healthy relationships require. Your natural human needs for affection, communication, reliability, and emotional presence trigger their attachment fears. But rather than acknowledging these fears, they blame you for having needs that make them uncomfortable. This deflection protects their self-image while invalidating your legitimate relationship requirements. This phrase typically emerges when you request basic relationship necessities like consistent communication, emotional support during difficult times, quality time together, or discussions about your connection's future. Instead of honestly discussing their capacity to meet these needs, they reframe your requests as evidence of your emotional instability or excessive neediness. This reframing allows them to avoid responsibility for their emotional limitations while making you feel ashamed for having normal human needs. The gaslighting aspect of this statement is particularly damaging because it makes you question your own emotional reality and relationship standards. Over time, you may internalize their perspective and begin to believe that your needs are indeed excessive, leading you to minimize your requirements and accept increasingly inadequate treatment. This erosion of your standards serves their need to avoid emotional responsibility while gradually destroying your self-respect and emotional well-being. This labeling also serves as preemptive justification for their future emotional unavailability and withdrawal. When they fail to provide emotional support, consistent communication, or reliable partnership, they'll reference your supposed neediness as explanation for their behavior. They create a narrative where their emotional distance is a reasonable response to your excessive demands rather than evidence of their relationship limitations. The phrase reveals their fundamental misunderstanding of healthy relationship dynamics, where mutual emotional support, regular communication, and emotional availability are basic requirements rather than excessive demands. Healthy partners understand that meeting each other's emotional needs is the foundation of intimate partnership, not an unreasonable burden that indicates psychological dysfunction. This statement also demonstrates their unwillingness to engage in the emotional labor that relationships require. Rather than developing greater emotional capacity or finding ways to meet your needs, they prefer to label those needs as problematic and expect you to minimize them. This approach ensures that you'll be responsible for all emotional accommodation while they remain unchanged and unaccountable. People who are genuinely committed to relationship growth acknowledge when they struggle to meet their partner's needs and work to develop greater capacity. They might say, "I'm having trouble with emotional intimacy, but I want to work on it," rather than labeling their partner's needs as excessive to avoid personal growth and responsibility. Phrase 4. I need space without saying why. When avoidant partners request space without providing any timeline, reassurance about their feelings, or explanation of what they need space for, they're essentially asking you to accept indefinite emotional abandonment while maintaining your availability for their eventual return. This isn't a reasonable request for temporary breathing room. It's a manipulation tactic designed to allow them to withdraw completely while keeping you emotionally invested and waiting. This phrase represents their desire to enjoy the benefits of being single while maintaining the security of knowing you're available when they decide they want connection again. They want to pursue other interests, people, or experiences without the responsibility of considering your feelings or maintaining relationship commitments, but they also want the comfort of knowing you'll be there when their exploration period ends. The psychology behind indefinite space requests involves their fundamental ambivalence about commitment and their need to test whether they can function happily without you while maintaining the option to return. They're essentially asking you to serve as their backup plan while they determine whether they want to remain in the relationship or pursue other options. This puts you in the degrading position of competing against their fantasies of alternative lives. The absence of timeline or reassurance in their space request reveals their unwillingness to take responsibility for the anxiety and uncertainty this creates for you. If they genuinely needed temporary space for legitimate reasons, they would provide reassurance about their feelings, explain what they hope to accomplish during the break, and offer a reasonable timeline for reconnection. The vagueness of their request suggests they want maximum flexibility without accountability. This phrase typically emerges when you begin requesting greater commitment, emotional availability, or relationship progression. Instead of honestly discussing their capacity for these things, they request space that allows them to avoid difficult conversations while maintaining the status quo. The space request becomes a way to pause relationship development without explicitly rejecting your needs. The manipulation aspect of indefinite space requests involves expecting you to remain emotionally available and committed while they explore their feelings without similar commitment to you. They want you to respect their need for distance while maintaining your emotional investment, creating a fundamentally unequal dynamic where your needs become irrelevant while theirs become paramount. This request also serves as a test of your willingness to accept indefinite uncertainty and emotional deprivation. Partners who agree to indefinite space without timeline or reassurance demonstrate their willingness to prioritize the avoidant's comfort over their own emotional security. This accommodation often encourages further boundary pushing and emotional withdrawal. The phrase reveals their belief that relationships should accommodate their emotional limitations without requiring reciprocal accommodation of your emotional needs. They expect you to understand and support their need for space, while providing no similar understanding or support for your need for connection and security. People who need temporary space for legitimate reasons provide specific explanations, timelines, and reassurance about their commitment. They might say, "I need a week to process some family issues, but I care about you and want to talk on Sunday," rather than requesting indefinite space that serves no clear purpose except avoiding relationship responsibilities. Phrase 5. I'm not ready for a relationship while acting like they're in one. When avoidant partners claim they're not ready for a relationship while simultaneously engaging in relationship behaviors like regular contact, physical intimacy, emotional sharing, and time investment, they're creating a psychological escape hatch that allows them to access relationship benefits without relationship responsibilities. This contradiction represents sophisticated emotional manipulation designed to keep you invested while protecting their freedom to withdraw without consequence. This phrase allows them to enjoy the positive aspects of partnership, companionship, physical intimacy, emotional support, and regular contact, while avoiding the accountability, commitment, and mutual responsibility that relationships require. They want to function as your partner without technically being your partner, creating a one-sided dynamic where you provide relationship energy while receiving none of the security that should accompany such investment. The psychology behind this contradiction involves their desire to test relationship waters without risking emotional vulnerability or commitment. By maintaining that they're not ready for relationships while engaging in relationship behaviors, they can gauge how much they enjoy partnership benefits while preserving their option to withdraw if intimacy becomes too threatening or demanding. This statement also serves as preemptive protection against accountability for their behavior. When they fail to prioritize you, provide emotional support, or maintain consistency, they can reference their earlier declaration about not being ready as justification for their limitations. They've inoculated themselves against responsibility by establishing from the beginning that they're not technically committed to meeting relationship standards. The contradiction between their words and actions reveals their fundamental dishonesty about their intentions and capacity. If they truly weren't ready for relationships, they would avoid relationship behaviors rather than engaging in them while disclaiming responsibility. Their willingness to act like partners while refusing partner accountability demonstrates manipulative rather than honest communication. This phrase typically emerges when you begin expecting greater consistency, commitment, or emotional availability based on their behavior toward you. Instead of honestly discussing what they can provide, they retreat behind their earlier disclaimer about not being ready, using it as justification for refusing to meet the expectations their own behavior created. The manipulation involves training you to accept relationship behaviors without relationship benefits. Over time, you become accustomed to providing emotional investment, physical intimacy, and partnership energy while receiving none of the security, priority, or commitment that should accompany such investment. You learn to give like a partner while accepting treatment like a casual acquaintance. This statement also prevents you from making informed decisions about your emotional investment. If someone is genuinely not ready for relationships, you can choose whether to wait or pursue other options. But when they claim unavailability while acting available, you're left confused about their true intentions and capacity, making it difficult to protect your own interests. The phrase reveals their belief that they should be able to access relationship benefits without providing relationship commitment or accountability. They want the emotional and physical intimacy that partnership provides without the responsibility to prioritize your needs, provide emotional support, or maintain consistent presence in your life. People who are genuinely not ready for relationships avoid relationship behaviors rather than engaging in them while disclaiming responsibility. They maintain appropriate distance and casual interaction rather than creating intimate connections they can honor with appropriate commitment and accountability. Phrase 6. That's just how I am. When avoidant partners respond to your legitimate relationship concerns with, "That's just how I am," they're declaring their unwillingness to grow, change, or accommodate your needs while expecting you to accept their limitations as permanent fixtures of the relationship. This phrase represents the end of productive relationship discussion and the beginning of your choice between permanent accommodation or walking away. This statement reveals their fundamental belief that personal growth and change are optional rather than necessary components of healthy relationships. Instead of viewing your concerns as opportunities for improvement or deeper understanding, they position them as attacks on their identity that must be deflected rather than addressed. This perspective makes them fundamentally incompatible with the mutual growth and adaptation that successful relationships require. The psychology behind this phrase involves their deep resistance to vulnerability and change that emotional growth requires. Rather than examining their behavior or considering how it affects you, they prefer to declare their patterns fixed and expect you to adapt. This rigidity protects them from the discomfort of self-reflection while placing all responsibility for relationship accommodation on your shoulders. This response also serves as manipulation designed to end uncomfortable conversations without providing resolution or change. By declaring their behavior immutable, they force you to choose between accepting inadequate treatment or being positioned as someone who doesn't accept them as they are. This false choice prevents legitimate discussion of relationship problems while making you responsible for either accommodation or rejection. The phrase typically emerges when you address patterns of behavior that consistently impact your emotional well-being or relationship satisfaction. Instead of engaging with your concerns or working towards solutions, they declare these patterns unchangeable and expect you to accept them permanently. This response transforms legitimate relationship discussions into ultimatums about acceptance versus rejection. The manipulation aspect involves reframing your reasonable requests for behavior change as attacks on their fundamental identity. They position themselves as victims of your unrealistic expectations rather than partners who could potentially modify harmful or inconsiderate behaviors. This victim stance prevents accountability while making you feel guilty for having legitimate relationship needs. This statement also reveals their misunderstanding of how healthy relationships function, where partners regularly adjust their behavior to accommodate each other's needs and promote mutual well-being. They view relationship requests for change as threats to their autonomy, rather than opportunities for deeper connection and mutual satisfaction. The phrase demonstrates their unwillingness to engage in the emotional labor that relationships require, including self-reflection, behavior modification, and mutual accommodation. They prefer to maintain their current patterns, regardless of how these patterns affect you or the relationship's health and sustainability. This response also prevents you from understanding whether their concerning behaviors stem from inability or unwillingness to change. By declaring behaviors fixed, they avoid revealing whether they lack the capacity for change or simply refuse to invest the effort required for relationship growth and improvement. People who are genuinely committed to relationship success view partner concerns as valuable feedback rather than personal attacks. They might say, "I struggle with this, but I want to work on it because our relationship matters to me," rather than declaring their problematic behaviors immutable and expecting permanent accommodation. Phrase 7. You knew what you were getting into. When avoidant partners respond to your relationship concerns or unmet needs by saying, "You knew what you were getting into," they're engaging in victim blaming that shifts responsibility for their inadequate treatment from their behavior to your decision to enter the relationship. This phrase represents their belief that early disclosure of their limitations absolves them of all responsibility for the emotional damage these limitations cause. This statement reveals their fundamental belief that informing you about their emotional unavailability, commitment issues, or relationship limitations provides them with permanent immunity from accountability for how these issues affect you. They operate under the assumption that your initial acceptance of their limitations means you forfeited the right to express hurt, disappointment, or need for change, regardless of how their behavior impacts your well-being. The psychology behind this phrase involves their need to avoid guilt and responsibility for the emotional damage their relationship patterns cause, rather than acknowledging that their behavior hurts you or examining whether they could modify harmful patterns. They blame you for entering a relationship with someone who warned you about their limitations. This blame shifting protects their self-image while making you responsible for all negative relationship consequences. This response also serves as manipulation, designed to silence your legitimate concerns and needs. By referencing your initial acceptance of their limitations, they attempt to invalidate any current distress or requests for change. This manipulation prevents ongoing relationship negotiation and improvement while locking you into permanent acceptance of inadequate treatment. The phrase typically emerges when you express frustration with patterns of emotional unavailability, inconsistency, or commitment avoidance that have been ongoing throughout your relationship. Instead of addressing your concerns or working towards solutions, they reference your initial decision to date them as evidence that you have no right to complain about predictable consequences. The victim-blaming aspect involves making you responsible for the emotional damage that their behavior creates. They suggest that because you chose to be with someone who disclosed their limitations, any pain or disappointment you experience is self-inflicted rather than caused by their treatment of you. This perspective absolves them of all responsibility for your emotional well-being. This statement also reveals their misunderstanding of how relationships develop and change over time. They assume that initial acceptance of limitations means permanent acceptance, regardless of how these limitations affect relationship growth. your emotional health, or your evolving needs and expectations as the relationship deepens. The phrase demonstrates their unwillingness to engage in ongoing relationship maintenance and improvement. They view early disclosure of limitations as sufficient relationship effort and expect you to accommodate these limitations permanently without complaint or request for change, regardless of how these limitations impact your happiness and fulfillment. This response also prevents honest examination of whether their limitations are truly fixed or whether they could potentially modify harmful patterns with effort and commitment. By blaming you for entering the relationship despite warnings, they avoid exploring whether change is possible or desirable. People who genuinely care about their partner's well-being acknowledge that early disclosure of limitations doesn't absolve them of responsibility for ongoing relationship impact. They might say, "I know I struggle with this, and I can see how it affects you. Let me work on finding ways to improve," rather than blaming their partner for accepting a relationship with known challenges. The psychology of why these phrases are relationship death sentences. These 7 phrases represent more than just difficult communication patterns. They reveal fundamental beliefs about relationships, emotional responsibility, and personal growth that predict ongoing dysfunction and emotional damage. Each phrase demonstrates the avoidant's core conviction that relationships should accommodate their limitations without requiring reciprocal accommodation of their partner's needs. The underlying psychology involves their deep-seated belief that emotional vulnerability and interdependence represent threats to their psychological safety rather than foundations for intimate connection. They've organized their entire relationship approach around avoiding the mutual vulnerability that healthy partnerships require, and these phrases serve as defense mechanisms designed to maintain emotional distance while accessing relationship benefits. These statements also reveal their fundamental misunderstanding of how healthy relationships function, where partners regularly adjust their behavior, provide mutual emotional support, and engage in ongoing growth and improvement. They view relationship requests for change, emotional availability, or commitment as unreasonable demands rather than normal partnership requirements. The manipulation aspect of these phrases involves shifting responsibility for relationship problems from their behavior to your expectations, needs, or decisions. This responsibility shift allows them to maintain their current patterns without guilt, while making you responsible for either accepting inadequate treatment or being positioned as unreasonable for wanting basic relationship necessities. Why walking away is the only healthy response. When avoidant partners use these phrases, they're providing you with crucial information about their capacity for healthy relationship participation that you must accept rather than trying to change. These statements represent their core beliefs about emotional responsibility and relationship commitment that predict years of frustration if you continue the relationship. Walking away immediately protects your emotional well-being from the systematic damage that occurs when you try to build intimate partnerships with people who explicitly reject the emotional vulnerability and mutual responsibility that relationships require. These phrases signal incompatibility that cannot be overcome through love, patience, or accommodation. Continuing relationships after these declarations typically results in gradually eroded self-respect, compromised emotional needs, and internalized beliefs that you're too needy or demanding for healthy partnership. The longer you stay, the more likely you are to accept treatment that falls far below your actual worth and relationship requirements. Most importantly, walking away creates space in your life for partners who can engage in genuine emotional partnership without viewing your needs as threats or burdens. Your emotional energy is precious and finite. Investing it in people who explicitly declare their inability to reciprocate represents a fundamental betrayal of your own worth and future happiness. These phrases aren't problems to solve, they're warnings to heed. When someone shows you who they are through these declarations, believe them and respond accordingly by choosing relationships that can actually meet your human needs for connection, emotional safety, and mutual growth.